This is Next Up, brought to you by Nexia Consulting, where we cover the biggest topics in the tech jobs market. So, thank you both for joining me for the first sustainability podcast for Next Up. Really excited to talk to you both about some of the sustainability topics within the UK. But yeah, let's start with you, Catalina. If you start with your introduction.
Thank you, Kloe, and thank you for inviting me to your podcast. By background, I'm an economist, and I have 2 master's degrees, one in infrastructure that covers telecom, that covers water, transport, and energy, which is very interesting because we will see in the conversation how these sectors are now interrelated. And then I have a second master's in energy policy and regulation. That's because I wanted to be part of this decarbonisation journey. I have worked in various sectors. I have worked with government, the regulator, Ofgem. I have worked with different big utilities like OVO Group and with infrastructure owners and operators, that's Cenobi Energy. I recently was working in the energy and natural resources team with KPMG. So to talk a little bit about the projects that interest me, anything decarbonization, but recently I have been working in interesting projects. One of them was helping the government of Gibraltar with the net zero strategy. So when I was at KPMG, I designed the delivery body for the government of Gibraltar, which was then translated into legislation that amended the Climate Change Act. And then I helped them during more than a year. So I will travel to Gibraltar every 2 months to meet with the Deputy Chief Minister and his cabinet and support the different working groups. That's sustainable finance, electrification of transport. So that was a very interesting project. And I also participated in other projects, including some projects helping the clusters, the different clusters that are decarbonizing in the UK. We will discuss that later. And I realized I was very interested in finance. So now I'm doing a CFA on ESG. And I'm hoping to continue the work that I'm doing, but also be a little bit more involved in the finance side of decarbonization. So that's about me.
Amazing. And over to you, Steve.
I think I better get my coat. Well, that was brilliant. So I'm Steve, and I have a CSE in woodwork. No, well, I do actually, but I also have a law degree. But I've been working in the renewable energy sector for the last 10 to 13 years, working with solar rather than any other technology. I've worked for some big Chinese manufacturers, and my job was really dealing with funders and asset and finance managers, fund managers, developers and EPC. So I was looking at the process of getting solar farms built, big utility scale projects. I left that about 18 months ago, and I started really concentrating on a networking platform. It's not for profit. I don't earn any money from it. I don't make any money at all. But it's aimed for women in the industry, smart energy industry. I call it Women Powering Smart Energy. And we run conferences, forums, social networking evenings, and it's brilliant.
Excellent.
We've got something coming up for the London Climate Action Week, the Mayor of London initiative. And I advertised the tickets for that a few weeks ago, and I have about 150 subscriptions so far, and people who are coming from as far afield as South America and India, Asia, across Europe. So I'm very pleased about that.
And I can second Stephen that his initiative is brilliant. I actually was with Stephen in an event earlier this week. And Stephen invited an author. Her name is Susan During, and she's helping women when they are on a transition. She just wrote a book that you can see on my video. The podcast listeners will not be able to see, but that really helped me because, as I say, I'm trying to get more involved in finance. So thank you, Steve, for your support.
It's a pleasure, and thank you to Susan for writing that book. And I hope she's going to pay you for plugging it. Well done. My book is, oh no, sorry. It was a brilliant evening, and we had some really amazing people. Well, all of the people in the audience were amazing, apart from me and two other guys. They were all business women in various industries, but smart energy and decarbonisation and sustainability mainly. Right.
Amazing. No, I think there's a lot there. There's a lot going on, really exciting things. And it's quite a rare occasion for there to be a man really endorsing a very women first kind of agenda. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that and kind of how that feels to be so outnumbered as well. I think it's very brave of you. So
No, it's not. I mean, I don't feel like a fish out of water. Very briefly, as I grew up from 7 years on, I didn't have a father. I had a mother and 3 sisters, and I grew up with all these females around me, and I had a brilliant time. And so I think I've got a certain amount of empathy there. I've always been one to champion the underdog. And I quite like to say what I'm thinking, irrelevant of the consequences, which is not always a good thing. But I just went to so many in the renewable energy industry. I was going to so many conferences, so many get-togethers, and predominantly there were men speakers, same men telling us the same thing. The event organizers would always choose the same people because it was safe. And I just thought, I've had enough. And I asked some of the event organizers, why do you very rarely have women? Well, we asked them and they don't want to come. And I thought, I don't believe that. So anyway, I thought I'd run some events, and sure enough, I never, ever have a problem in getting brilliant women, brilliant experts to come and talk and impart their knowledge. And what I found is a lot of their ideas are fresh, are new, their perceptions are different. They look at things in a different way to a lot of, I mean, there are brilliant men out there as well, don't get me wrong. But, there are so many brilliant women in this industry and everywhere. They're just not getting the platform to tell everybody about what they do and how they do it. And I think that's scandalous. So rather than just keep talking about how upset I was with the discrepancy in gender and the gender bias, I thought, well, I'll do something. Whatever it is, I'll do something because I must and I can. So why not? So I do.
Absolutely. You set a great example there. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty sustainability questions. So question number 1, is hydrogen a sustainable option, and should it only be green hydrogen and not low carbon?
So I'm going to set up a little bit the context. As you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced the 6th report, and we have a conference on March 2023. So what does it tell us? And not technical words, it tells us we are in a crisis. It's no longer an emergency. It's no longer a climate emergency. We are a crisis. And I like this sentence or this image is like humanity sitting on a very thin glass, and this glass is melting very quickly. So there's 2 ways to see it. There's like a very catastrophic and negative side, and how I see it is like a GPS. It's telling us the route that you're taking is wrong. There are accidents, there's catastrophe, there's hunger, there's crisis, there's loss of biodiversity, but you can change the route. And that's why the different countries are setting up their plans, what they call their NDCs. So the nationally determined contributions, which is how they commit to the Paris Agreement that was signed in COP21. So the different countries will come with the strategies. And one of the documents that support the UK strategy, we have two big documents that relate to one another. It's the Energy White Paper and the 10-point plan. And that's what we're going to talk about in this podcast. So we're going to go into the different technologies and have a little bit of a discussion on where we are. So that sets up a little bit for the listeners. Why are we talking about this? Why is this so important? So just to answer the first question, so we're starting with hydrogen. So what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. The process is quite energy intensive. So if we start with the production problem, the problem is it requires a lot of energy to have this hydrogen that we need. And at the moment, this energy comes sometimes from fossil fuel. So to have something clean that is hydrogen, we are using fossil fuel. So that's the production problem. Now I'm going to say, why do we need hydrogen? Because we need to decarbonize different sectors. We need to decarbonize heating. We need to decarbonize industrial sectors, and we need to decarbonize transport. There are some modes of transport that could not use big batteries. It's not efficient. Some of them are shipping, aviation, and heavy vehicles. And for those sectors that we cannot electrify, we can use hydrogen. But we also can use hydrogen for other industrial products. Now, as I say, at the moment, there's some production of hydrogen that is what we call gray hydrogen. It's produced with fossil fuels. We don't want that. We want green hydrogen that is produced with wind farms. So this excess energy that we can have, for example, in Scotland, instead of losing that energy or creating constraints in the grid, we can use it to produce hydrogen. So then we will have another source of renewable energy, but also hydrogen can act as storage, because instead of putting this energy when we don't need it in the grid, we can use it to transform it to hydrogen and use it when we need it. So are we against then fossil fuel hydrogen, which we call gray hydrogen? I don't think so, because this is the first phase to get hydrogen. And we need to get the infrastructure, but also we need to get this product ready to start building all these connections that we need. So if you think so, we need to start. The hydrogen producers need to know that there will be off-takers, and we need to transition this energy now. So that's what we call a transition period, when we will have gray hydrogen, but hoping to move to green hydrogen. And another advantage of hydrogen is, right now in the UK, we have invested billions in our infrastructure. That's the gas infrastructure. And just not to lose that infrastructure and reuse it, we can reuse it with hydrogen. And there are some pilots in the UK that are using hydrogen for heating, a blend of hydrogen. Right now, we have a 20% blend of hydrogen, and we are looking at moving at 100% hydrogen that will replace natural gas. So that's my views on hydrogen, and I pass over to Steve.
Yeah, I was just thinking about everything you were saying there, Catalina, and very interesting too. And just going back to the IPCC 6th report and what government should do. One of the key things was obviously reduce emissions, CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases sharply and immediately, and give up fossil fuels. Now, that's a big ask, but it's one of the things that the report has said is something that must happen if we're going to reach our climate goals laid out in the Paris Agreement back in 2015. Investments is another critical part of that report, and a rethinking of and a restoration of agriculture, forests, and on land, and developing new technologies, carbon capture, or sort of exploring other means of climate repair. So what can be achieved in such a short time is much down to cost, as we obviously know. So incentivize private investments, long-term continuation of policy and regulation by governments, equal and equitable social involvements and access to all public services, which have to be affordable. And I really do believe that a green transition can only happen and be realized with a just transition. All of these things must come together and run parallel. We need a change of mindsets. We need cross-party collaboration, a reset of laws and taxation policies, economic policy, and probably how we measure growth and success of a country. Because at the moment we still, the Western world is wrapped in ways of doing things which are not really fit for the sort of world we're living in. So this has all got to come together. So it's not an easy thing to do. Is hydrogen a sustainable option? I think green hydrogen is the only type of hydrogen we should be talking about. And one of the arguments against hydrogen is that it's much feted by the oil and gas companies, as is carbon capture, because it's introducing a way of looking like we're doing something, but actually we're continuing business as usual. We're still extracting, we're still exploring for new oil and gas reserves. So green hydrogen, if you listen to Greenpeace or Sierra Club or any group that is looking for real sustainability, they would tell you that the only hydrogen option possible is green. It's or pink if it's coming from nuclear, but grey and blue, that's no good because it will still produce CO2 emissions. As Catalina just said there, green hydrogen probably requires 3 times as much energy to compress as does natural gas. So the cost is high, and it's probably at the moment about 4 to 5 times more expensive than natural gas. And also, if you're going to utilize green hydrogen to decarbonize heavy industry, that will take an inordinate amount of electricity and power to do that. And so the only real way to meet the demand to accelerate is for hydrogen is to accelerate renewable energy production, increase nuclear energy production. A lot of our nuclear energy is coming offline in the UK. And that will also in itself create significant infrastructure and design challenges, such as prioritizing hydrogen pipelines and transmission lines. And the expansion of hydrogen gas industry will have significant regulatory ramifications. It's also the leakiest gas known to man. I mentioned hydrogen about 4 or 5 years ago to the Chief Environmental Officer of Greenpeace in the UK, Doug Parr, or I think he's a scientific officer. And I said, this is a really good thing. And he said, it would never work because it leaks too much. It's the smallest and lightest molecule in the universe. It's the leakiest gas known to man, he said. So it can readily leak out of pipes and other sections of the gas network that exists, which is designed to transport larger methane molecules, natural gas molecules. It reacts differently with different metals than methane gas. It can therefore weaken and corrode steel pipelines, commonly found in high pressure gas transmission systems, which we have currently. And also any leakage of hydrogen could actually undermine the benefits of green hydrogen and increase the life cycle emissions of other types of hydrogen, because hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas, meaning if it combines with other compounds in the atmosphere to cause warming, that's 5 times more potent than CO2 over a 100-year time frame. So it has limitations. At the moment, a lot of, it's an unproven technology on a large scale. And I know there are pilot projects around the UK and elsewhere in the world, but we still have yet to drive an economy on hydrogen gas, heating households, heating industry, doing all the things that natural gas does at the moment. But having said all of that, we should not stop trying. But I'm just wondering and concerned if we have time enough between now and 2030, ready to put the brakes on reducing emissions through banking on something like hydrogen as being a savior.
Definitely. I think you guys have certainly taught me a lot in that short amount of time. My knowledge of hydrogen stopped at hydrogen buses. So the fact that now this conversation is spread around all of the solutions that we need, it's not just transport, it's heating, as you said, and I guess people are probably very unaware of the process cancelling something out. I was totally unaware that actually the production is part of the problem as well. So that's quite an interesting one. I'm sure there's been things in the past that have had about 10 different problems, and then you have 7, and then you have 5, and gradually it gets less and less. I'm hoping that will be the case in this area, but a lot of factors. Yeah,
I remember reading somewhere, and I don't know where, but I think to roll on any new technology across the globe, if you like, so mass commercial use, takes around 50 years. I mean, I might be remembering that wrong, but it's not an instantaneous thing. Even if it starts to work, as I say, the infrastructure to manage a hydrogen gas supply across the UK, let alone across the world, could take a long time. Natural gas, North Sea gas, its introduction over electricity, coal-fired plants took a long time. And the thing is, we don't have a long time to change what we're doing. So that IPCC report was really saying we've got to reduce carbon emissions by at least 40 to 50% by 2030. And we've got to stop using fossil fuels. And the problem is, our government in the UK, in the US, in Scandinavia, all around the world, are still granting licenses for oil and gas companies to explore for new sources of oil and gas and to extract that gas once they found it. And again, I think, it's an oil rig, for example, has got to run. It's got to be drawing out billions of barrels of oil over a 20-year period just to sort of to cover its costs. So these aren't things that are going to be shelved after 5 years. If we build new oil and gas plants, and then they're not here for the short term, they're going to be around for the long term. And the stranded assets that may occur, again, we've got to think about all the people that work on those. If we give up tomorrow oil and gas, and we've got to find funding for new technologies that can, actually make these stranded assets safe.
Definitely. And that brings me nicely on to my next question. How far away are we from providing green public transport and a connected network of cycle lanes?
Do you want to go, Catalina?
Yes, I work for a company called Zenobi Energy for 3.5 years. So Zenobi Energy, that are owners and operators of charging infrastructure, but also electric vehicles. It was a very exciting journey, so I want to take a little bit on the journey. It was an electric bus, actually. So we had this problem at the beginning where we didn't know where to start, because you need the electric vehicles to be on the road for the charging infrastructure to decide that they want to put a charging infrastructure, because for example, a station of, I don't want to say something, but let's say BP will have a station and they say, okay, if I put 11 chargers, I need to know that I have enough users. But at the same time, users will say, if I don't have the stations, I have range anxiety. So I'm scared that I'm not going to go very far with my electric vehicle because I'm not going to be able to find where to charge it. So we had this problem at the beginning, and we also needed to, Ofgem and the Department for Transport needed to coordinate and have a plan together on, I will put electric vehicles, but I want to know that you will support us with the constraints. So they need a lot of stakeholders to come together, and we're very glad that this is happening now. There are a lot of zero emission zones now in London, and we had the first battery on a depot on a bus. I don't want to say, I can't remember if it was Newport or Guildford, but there was one of the two first stations in the UK with electric buses. So electric buses have some constraints. For example, they are more expensive than conventional buses. So they could be as much as the double or 3 times more expensive. And that's due to, was at the time, that's due to the battery. The battery is very expensive. Now I see a lot, I don't have the exact numbers on buses and electric buses, but now I see a lot of posters, because I check this when I go on the tube, that say almost all our fleet is now electric. So from being there 3.5 years ago, setting up the first battery on the depot to charge and put this infrastructure for the bus operators to have their first electric buses, to seeing this huge improvement in London, for me has been quite significant. So that's a big change in some years. So that other things to consider on transport, and there's a lot of debate when, rightly so, some people will say, well, electric buses are not 100% green because you will need, the batteries need to be manufactured, the cars need to be manufactured. But on the long duration of the vehicle is much more less intensive on CO2 emissions. That's conditional of, and that's how everything is related to everything now. So that's how you get transport, communications, water, energy, everything comes together, because the electric system that provides that energy needs to be coming from renewables. So it all depends on the mix of the country. So if your country, like the UK, achieve 100% renewables, then obviously the energy that you're consuming for your car, is renewable. But it will have less of an impact if we come back to oil and gas, because it will be inefficient. That we have a battery and then we charge it with fossil fuels. We really want to be charging it with a renewable energy. But again, I think it's, even if we haven't achieved 100% mix of renewables in the UK, I think it's good that we transition those cars. And now the UK has put bans on ICE vehicles, and we have a ban, and that's important for what Steve says. For example, a car, if you start buying it now, it has a long time to go on the road. So we need to put a ban on anything that's fossil fuel charged cars. But ultimately, yes, the best way of transport, and when we need to move forward, is using public transport, having more cycles, walking, sharing our vehicles. Move from an ownership type of vehicle to a sharing and like mass transport. We see on the road sometimes cars for 5 people with 1 person is not efficient. That's not what we need. So ultimately, the best solution is electric buses, bicycles. That's what I want to say. But it has been, for example, here in London, when I have followed the transition, very interesting for me. So I don't know, Steve, what are your comments on transport?
Well, how far away is it? In the UK, it's probably 10 years away at least. I remember, we probably all remember, in 2020, after COVID, and we'd all been locked up for a long time, Boris Johnson sort of threatened that the UK would be threaded with thousands of miles of curb-protected cycleways and walkways, which would be built to, new high standards, pledging $2 billion for this revolutionary plan. It was a strategy he called gear change. And he said that he aims to kick off the most radical change to cities since the arrival of mass motoring. And I'm not sure if we've seen thousands or any miles of new high standard walkways and cycleways anywhere in any cities. I'm sure there are some sort of painted cycle lanes somewhere that weren't there before 2020. But the problem we've got again is obviously, it's funding. It's changing a mindset. Now, one of the most greenest way to travel around is to walk or to cycle. Public transport, other European countries can do that. Stockholm, for example, has been running on 100% renewable energy since 2017. And that's when it comes to sort of metros, buses and local trains. Germany, Berlin, Munich, they all have fantastic public transport systems in the city. So the S-Bahn, and these are running affordably, cheaply. That's the other thing we don't have, particularly in our UK cities, is affordable and regular and pleasant transport systems. They're expensive, they're dirty, they're old-fashioned, they don't run on time, and I'm not talking about the strikes. I'm just talking about generally. We have they're old, they're antiquated, they're out of date, a lot of them. So we really need to be considering to make our public transport green and more connected. It needs to be affordable, and I think Tallinn in Estonia was voted the greenest city in Europe this year, and they've had free public transport for residents since 2013. So there are a lot of examples of how to run things, and sort of mayors of big cities are taking it into their own hands to change things, change the way things are being done. The removal of waste in a city, how they use that waste, whether they use it for waste incineration with some carbon capture to burn it for heating, for example. The Scandinavian cities like Stockholm, like Copenhagen, they all seem to be getting it right much faster and a lot sooner if you go back the last couple of decades in certain instances, in getting their public services in big cities and big urban areas a lot greener than we have here. So it's not necessarily just about having electric buses or electric vehicles or having a congestion charge in the hope that that's going to put people driving internal combustion engine vehicles into the city. We need a real rethink and reset of how a sustainable city, a smart city looks. And we have a lot of AI now, a lot of data information, big data. There's a lot more we could do with controlling the levels of traffic. And, how often do we sit in traffic jams because traffic lights are out, or our roads are so old that you have a gridlock because there's been an accident 2 miles away. There's a whole rethink to looking at this, but again, it's finding investment, and most of the investment for everything that we're talking about is going to end up coming from private investors. It's going to be the private sector which generates a lot of the investment to do this. So, the government have got to have policies, long-term plans, long-term paybacks to incentivize investors to get involved. But public transport needs a big rethink. It's expensive. It's not nice to use. It's unsafe for a lot of people. All people. It's not just being green. It's being usable, which we need to address as well. But how far away are we from providing green public transport, connected network of cycle lanes? We're not going to, we're going to see a change of government at some point, and they're going to have their own plans. And this is the problem with our systems. Boris pledges something back in 2020, thousands of miles of cycle lanes. He goes, somebody else gets in. So she goes, somebody else gets in. Policies change. The world changes. But if we're going to get to where we need to be with these things, whoever's in government has to follow through on these pledges and these promises, because if they don't, and if the Treasury can't find the funds for it, then they're going to have to, go to the private sector and say, we need to get this done. And this is what it will do for you if you invest your money now.
Thank you, Stephen. Just to clarify a couple of dates from me, it was not 3 years and a half ago. I say 3 years and a half at Cenobi, but it was probably now 5 or 6 years ago that we have our first depot. Steve, you are very hard with London. I need to share that I sometimes take bus route number 9, which takes me to a very beautiful, I have my double decker and I go upstairs, as I call it, and I have a very beautiful view of Royal Albert Hall, and then I go to Green Park. And so for me, that I have lived in different cities, you have very high standards, but I do enjoy my London transport.
Local transport is brilliant to have, but we could do better, that's all.
It definitely sounds like it's quite a political stance as well, that it's not just a case of ticking a box and getting something done. I think that it seems to be so deep rooted with a lot of other issues and a lot of other kind of political stances. And
I think there are, obviously, in everything we do, there's politics involved, and politicians ultimately are driving the way forward based on what the electorate wants. And at the moment, I'm hearing that really what the electorate really wants is the removal of small boats and all these things. I'm thinking, actually, I'm not sure if that's really the case at the moment. I would imagine the majority of people want affordable public transport, money in their pocket, lower costs of food, lower heating bills, better national health service, better infrastructure generally. And we're told a lot by governments of all hues. It's not just Conservative, it's Labour. The Green Party can say what they like because the chances of them ever getting in are probably nil. The Lib Dems the same, which is unfair because all these parties have some great ideas. But yes, the thing is, you can tell the electorate whatever you want, but if you take too long to follow through on it, then you're just going to get stuck and you're going to be voted out, and then somebody else is going to come in and make changes, and then they'll get voted out. I mean, this government's been in a long time. Not this particular government we have, but the Conservative government. And I thought, to be honest, the first David Cameron, the Nick Clegg and David Cameron government probably worked the best, because they neither could just sort of run their own ideas through. They had to consult. It was more collaborative. And I think definitely the solar industry took off during that time, from 2010 onwards to where it is now, and that's a relatively short period of time. But it's still 13 years on, and we're still getting there with solar. So, it does take time, all of these things, and that is the problem we have, time.
Definitely. And Catalina, what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, if you're feeling hopeless, like some people may do, I'm talking to the listeners, if you're feeling hopeless, like what can I do? I'm not in government. There's lots of things that you can do. And you can always be an activist. And by that, I don't mean only like Extinction Rebellion type of activism, which actually works because it puts some pressure. But you can get involved, like responding to public consultations. That actually works. They need to take into account your views. You can write to your MP. You can actually attend some committee meetings, so all-party parliamentarian meetings. So previously, I used to work in government affairs. And I try to be involved in the conversation. So have been attending different all-party parliamentarian groups on net zero housing or sustainable finance. And this is a space of collaboration between, as the name says, and as a lot of people know, with different parties when they talk about the subjects and they agree on a subject and they work together very well towards the subject. But if you're feeling like you want to have your voice heard, do go and contact an association, and that really makes a change.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's hopeless, and it's not all doom and gloom at all. There are so many things we can do, which, are relatively simple. But, the politics do come into it, but there's Dr. Christine Hemingway. She wrote a book about the corporate social entrepreneur, sort of in line with corporate social responsibility. And it was basically talking about the people inside companies that can make big changes. And that's what we need. We need more corporate social entrepreneurs inside businesses that can actually encourage others within that business and the board members of those businesses to make changes to their business in the way they operate, the impact they have around the world or locally. All of these things we can do. We shouldn't necessarily pin all our hopes on technology and sit back and think, well, that's going to take care of everything, and I don't really need to do much else other than talk about, carbon capture or green hydrogen, and that's going to be fine because we're going to have, hydrogen fuel cell cars. They've been around for years, but it always comes down to cost. And the cheapest electric car is with a lithium-ion battery. That's what's now being rolled out all over the world. But, again, there are issues with all the minerals required for that. How sustainable is it over a period of 50, 100 years? We don't know. And I just think let's not keep jumping into everything without thinking it through a bit further and changing the way we do things. But if I thought it was sort of doom and gloom, I read something about a spiral of hope rather than a tunnel of gloom. And, there are so many things we can do, we should be doing, we are doing, and we are making a change. But my concern always is looking at those levels of CO2 globally, and they keep rising. And we've had lots of new technologies around for a lot of time. And I think one of the biggest saviors for decarbonisation could be nuclear energy. And I was always against nuclear energy because of the obvious, because of the fear. But it's staring us in plain sight. It is a technology which we've had working, producing power generation for a long time now, since 50s, 60s. And it's getting better and it's getting newer. And if we look at technologies as being the savior, the technologies involved in storing the waste is getting better and better as time goes on. And if nuclear energy could sort of, again, I remember being a talk with a guy called Michael Schellenberger, and he is very pro-nuclear, and I'm not going to say he's anti-renewables, but I don't think he holds much store in it being the way forward on its own. And I remember him saying, if we all lived on nuclear energy and no fossil fuel energy, if it was all nuclear, in heating, in lighting, in industry, we would all produce as individuals by the end of our life no more than a Coke can full of nuclear waste. So, if we can store that in a safe way, perfect. I mean, there are ways of doing things. So it's not completely gone. But oil and gas companies do have huge influence over politicians and governments the world over.
Well, I think that's led us on quite nicely, because my next question was going to be around nuclear power, and could it be a better option So Catalina, do you
Yes.
think it could be a better option?
So why do we need nuclear power in the mix, and where are the controversies around it? Obviously, we are trying to move to purely renewable energy. That will be the ideal word. But renewable energy comes with some constraints for the grid. So the very basics, as you know, is at any time the electricity needs to be balanced between demand and generation. If it is not, then there is a blackout. If it is too much or not as much, then there is a blackout. So that's the role of a national grid, which operates a grid. And renewables come with a lot of problems, and it's not only the problem that we cannot get that power to be generated when we need it. That's a problem of quantity, and that's a big problem. But there's other problems, like, for example, more fossil fuel type of generation has some ways of being produced that is constant, is all the time the same load, the same quantity, but there are also some rotating motors that are in those plants that will help the grid to balance things like reactive power, the frequency, the inertia. There are some technical terms, but national grid needs to contract to services now that we are integrating renewable much more. And that's how your battery at home could help the grid. And that's what we're seeing with cars, like helping the grid. It's not necessarily only with the quantity, which is related, but it's also with those things that we need to balance the grid. So that's the problem with renewables. To have a certain base load, we can use nuclear. So nuclear, if we have a nuclear plant, we can have certainty that 10, 20, 70%, depends on the mix we want, that this energy will be constant and it will be all the time there. Now, what are some of the critics of nuclear? And Steve mentioned the waste. We still don't know what to do with the waste. We still don't fully understand the dangers. We still don't understand if we can store it. So waste is one concern. Another concern is obviously the obvious concern with nuclear, that it will cause a disaster and global scale disaster. So and the other problem that we see with nuclear is how long it takes to be built. So we have seen, for example, here with Hinkley Point C, how much delay it takes to build a plant, and we need this decade to be decisive. So even if we start building those plants now, it's not sure that we will have them ready for 2030, and that's a problem. Now we have other technologies, which are, for example, the small nuclear reactors that could take 2 years, 3 years to be built, and we could have those plants entering the system. So yeah, nuclear could be a good mix to replace oil and gas, but it's the timing and also some concerns about the safety of it. And that's why some countries like Germany or France are decommissioning some plants, and they're not. But you could argue that, for example, if we had more nuclear in the system and we haven't decommissioned those plants, maybe Europe will not be right now in the crisis, because we will not be so reliant on natural gas. And so we wouldn't see that soar in energy bills. That brings me to another problem of finance, is to have asset owners committing to build a nuclear plant. They need a contract and a certainty of, I don't know the length of the contract, but I imagine it's not shorter than 15 years, 30 years, 50 years. The price of nuclear is much more expensive than the price of renewables. So you could say that maybe we need rather to wait to see we can have storage with hydropower, long duration storage technologies that are coming, battery storage for short term, or store with hydrogen. And that's some of the debate around nuclear. And Steve, do you have views?
Yeah, nuclear has been expensive. It's the most regulated energy generator in the world, and quite rightly so. There are very few regulations on renewables. And my concern about waste is from solar panels and from turbine blades. these they can't be, they're ending up in landfill. We don't have the infrastructure to recycle them. And I think at the moment, turbine blades they can't do anything with them. They cannot be recycled. So there's a real argument for, improving our recycling industry. But again, this is expensive. And finding different ways of manufacturing with a sort of cradle to cradle design, so these can be made, and once they're spent and they've used their useful life, they can be dismantled, and all the things out of it, like all the minerals and the metals, can be taken out easily and reused. Because at the moment we're just throwing, valuable metals and minerals, and that's we're just throwing them away. So there is a waste issue with every way you generate power. But nuclear is obviously the biggest worry to everybody, because any problem with a nuclear plant, and in the old days, and going back to the last one, which was Fukushima, I think, was probably the last major problem. A lot of the deaths caused there were panic, not actually from the radiation from the plant. I think that, relatively speaking, the plant was relatively safe, but it suffered. Was there a tsunami, an earthquake? I can't really remember, but the panic involved the stampede to get people out. That caused most of the deaths involved in that tragedy and that catastrophe. But there's a big issue around that. But I think with the small modular reactors that Catalina mentioned, there are technologies which will be a lot safer. And I don't think necessarily our plants that we've built are unsafe, but they are old design. But again, it's getting investors in, because investors want quick returns on their investment. And they get that with renewables. A solar plant doesn't take that long to build. It takes quite a long time to get it developed and through planning, and then finding a grid connection and all that stuff, which is getting longer and longer at the moment, because again, our infrastructure can't really handle it all. But that's what investors are looking for. They're looking for quick profit, quick returns on investment, and nuclear doesn't give them that. So it's really got to be a government, a state-owned, state-backed thing. And it is a worry when as globalization looks like it's becoming deglobalization, and all those geopolitical things that were mentioned in the IPCC report for the first time. When you have China backing your nuclear industry in the UK, it now looks more worrying than it did 10 years ago, or at least more of a concern. So, we've got to look at how we can do a lot of this and give ourselves energy security by making sure that our partners are secure and our friends. And typically that's going to be private investment. I think Rolls-Royce, there's a number in a consortium that are looking to build these new SMRs, and a lot of it's private money with some government backing and funds. And that's how it should be now.
Definitely. I think we've got time for one more quick question. So I'll give you guys a choice. Would you like a question about government funding or diversity?
Catalina, you can choose.
Let's go for diversity, because we have Steve here. So I don't mind starting, because I think Steve has a lot to say. First of all, I really think that diversity, and I'm talking here about women in the energy industry, because we have Steve. I think it cannot be achieved if we don't have the support of men, because we still have the majority of CEO and leaders male. So if we want to get to those leadership positions, we often need the support and mentorship and the trust of men. I also want to mention, is very important as well, the support other women. I want to here mention a couple of women that have been very supportive to me. I have had an informal mentor, which sometimes you have formal mentors, but sometimes you have informal mentors. And this is somewhere when I was at Cenobi Energy. I was part of a trade association, and they were looking for a chair of a working group. And I didn't feel at all like I was prepared to do that. And this woman, she told me, her name is Madeleine, and she said, you should do it. You need to do it. I think you'll be great. And I didn't want to. And I did a sharing this working group, and that I started realizing that I really enjoyed those positions, and actually I could do those things. And that helped me to dream bigger. So I really encourage this. And why do we need women? Then you're going to say, why do we need women? That's a good question. We want to be there, but do we need women? And women in general, there's some studies that show that women in general are more interested in ESG. They're more supportive for any sustainability, diversity, but being in communities. So generally, women that when they're in the leadership positions, these companies will have better ESG agendas. But why is that important for companies again? Why do they want ESG? So during the crisis, and for example, COVID, where there was an economic crisis, they were tracking companies that had a better index on ESG, and these companies performed better. But also we're moving to a world where we're going to have mandatory reporting on ESG for a lot of companies, but also different investors and group of investors. We do want to get more women, and it is even worse when we go to finance. That's what I want to move to finance. And for example, I think it was the S&P 500 that I saw that only this month we raised the low bar, the very, very low bar to have in the S&P 500 more women that are leaders than people that are named John. So that shows how little VC capital and leaders on the main firms are women, and we do need more women. And now I pass it to our great supporter, Steve.
Well, all I would say very quickly is that it's such a shame that we're having this discussion in the year 2023. I'm baffled by it, but it does exist, and it exists in the energy industry and the legal industry and every other industry you want to talk about, probably. And it's not right, and it's not just gender bias. You know, there's the racial thing. You know, people of color, people in the global south. There is so much disparity, inequity, and inequality across every sort of step of life, and it's got to change. You know, it has to change, because, as I said already at the outset, you know, any kind of transition, and the world is transitioning, whether we want to go with it or not. But you know, to get there easier, to get there quicker, and to get there with more hope and less despondency, we've all got to be involved in that. And you know, if the way our systems work, where we're almost excluding 50% of the population because they are women, that's mad. And this is probably why we're in the trouble we're in, because we haven't included women enough in the decision-making process for so many years. And I would imagine if women were in charge, as men were and still are, you know, 30 years ago, we would probably not have the climate change issues we have. And I mean, one woman who spoke on it, and I've got mixed feelings about her, but Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan probably knew exactly the problems of climate change. And she spoke about climate change a lot. But unfortunately, she found herself in a situation where North Sea oil saved her bacon financially, and it saved our economy back in the 70s. So, I mean, Thatcher made so many changes, good or bad, depends on your point of view, but she was a formidable woman, formidable leader. And, you know, there are plenty of other examples out there. We should stop talking about, men should do a lot more. I mean, women have done all they can, and they continue to do so, but men are still doing very little. And I think, they're complicit. Even if they say, look, I'm all for women's rights and putting women forward, but actually I'm not going to get involved in that because it's a bit of an area which I feel I'm treading on eggshells. I just think I'm going to do this, and some women think I'm probably interfering. Others think what sort of person is he? But I don't really care because ultimately I know why I'm trying to do it. And I'm just trying to highlight brilliant people. And when I see a brilliant man and he wants to join, or I would like him to be part of an event I'm running, I ask him. And a lot of the time they say, am I the only man? Or, how many men? And I say, well, you are the only man, or you're one of two men. And there's a panel of 10. They'll say, I think I'm busy. So, a lot of this comes down to men. They've got to change the way they approach gender equality. So do it.
Love that. Yeah, I think just doing this podcast alone, I've been asked, are you against speaking to men? And absolutely not. It's not that I'm in a position where I only ever want to hear a woman's point of view. I love hearing a man's point of view and maybe why there is those barriers there. And I think a lot of men are aware of those barriers, but they kind of feel like they can't do anything about it because they're not a woman themselves. So I think that's quite interesting that you've brought that up, and it's quite a powerful thing. It's to be able to say, yeah, there's a problem here and something needs to be done about it. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. I think it's brilliant if men can just do what they should do. And it's not doing anything particular. It's just treating everybody equally. End of story. I'm really tired of hearing men say, well, I'm all for women because I've got 3 daughters and a wife, as if they're some sort of pets to be kept. Well, okay. But it's all wrong, and it could change so easily. And I think, what we need is a level playing field. And people say to me, when you have your events, Steve, why are they always for women? And I say, well, they're not always for women at all. Men and women can attend, but men choose not to because they think they're going to be in a room full of women. So that's their choice. But I sometimes think, well, I'm glad it's for women because, and men saying, why can't I come? Because I want to. And I think, well, once we've got a level playing field, then, we'll get real equality. But I think women have got to get a level playing field first. When they're not starting off with the same benefits as a white male does. It's the way society runs at the moment. So there's a lot to do, but actually gender inequality on its own is something which we could get rid of so easily if men took the initiative.